The entire mansion fell silent when the stranger spoke. "You built the most powerful mafia empire in New York, but you don't even know the woman sleeping in your own house." Every eye in the grand hall turned toward Dominic Russo. The most feared mafia boss in New York slowly lifted his glass of whiskey, his dark gaze locked on the man standing across the room. Alejandro Vega. His rival. And possibly the only man reckless enough to challenge him publicly. The air inside the Russo mansion felt heavy with tension. Politicians, business tycoons, and crime bosses who had come to celebrate Dominic's annual winter gala suddenly looked uncomfortable. Because Alejandro had just said something dangerous. Something personal. Dominic set his glass down carefully. "You came all the way from Los Angeles," Dominic said calmly, "just to embarrass yourself." Alejandro smiled slightly. "Oh, I'm not embarrassing myself tonight." His eyes slowly scanned the room. "I'm embarrassing you." A few guests shifted nervously. Dominic's men subtly stepped forward, their hands close to their weapons. Dominic didn't move. His voice was quiet. "You have 10 seconds to explain." Alejandro tilted his head. "Simple." He leaned slightly closer. "Your wife." The word echoed through the hall. Dominic's expression hardened. "My wife is none of your concern." Alejandro laughed softly. "That's the problem, Dominic. You say that like you actually know her." The room fell completely silent. Dominic stared at him. Alejandro continued calmly. 4 years. 4 years of marriage, and no one in this room has ever seen your wife stand beside you." Several guests exchanged glances. It was true. Dominic Russo was married. Everyone knew that. But no one had ever seen the woman. Alejandro folded his arms. "Tell me something, Dominic. Do you even remember what she looks like?" Dominic's patience was beginning to thin. "You're testing your luck." Alejandro leaned closer. "No. I'm testing your ignorance." Then he whispered something that made Dominic's eyes narrow. "She's far more dangerous than you think." Upstairs, on the second-floor balcony, Danielle Carter froze. She had been watching the entire scene from the shadows. Like she always did. Invisible. Unnoticed. Ignored. For 4 years, Danielle Carter had lived inside Dominic Russo's mansion like a ghost. She ate alone. She walked through empty halls. And when Dominic passed her in the corridor, he barely even looked at her. Their marriage existed only on paper. A business arrangement. A contract. Nothing more. Danielle rested her hands on the balcony railing as the voices below echoed through the hall. Alejandro Vega knew. Somehow, he knew. And if he said the wrong thing tonight, everything Danielle had spent years hiding would collapse. Below, Dominic stepped closer to Alejandro. "You're wasting my time." Alejandro smiled slowly. "No. I'm saving it." He turned slightly toward the crowd. Because if Dominic Russo knew who his wife really was, his voice carried across the room. He would have been protecting her instead of pretending she didn't exist. A ripple of whispers spread through the guests. Dominic's eyes darkened. "You're finished." His men immediately moved forward. But Alejandro raised one hand. "Relax. I'm not here to start a war tonight." His gaze shifted toward the staircase that led to the upper level of the mansion. For a moment, Danielle thought his eyes met hers. "You'll figure it out soon enough," Alejandro said quietly. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. Dominic watched him go. Something about the conversation bothered him. Alejandro wasn't bluffing. Dominic had spent years studying his enemies. Alejandro Vega never played games without a reason. The guests slowly resumed their conversations, though the tension remained. Dominic walked toward the staircase. Upstairs, Danielle stepped away from the balcony quickly. Her heart pounded. Footsteps echoed on the marble stairs. Heavy. Confident. Dominic Russo. For the first time in months, he was coming to her floor. Danielle quickly walked down the quiet hallway toward her room. But Dominic's voice stopped her. "Danielle." She froze. It had been weeks since he last said her name. Slowly, she turned around. Dominic stood at the end of the hallway, his dark suit sharp against the soft lighting. He studied her like someone seeing a stranger. You were listening. Danielle answered calmly. This is my house too. Dominic walked closer. For a moment, he looked at her properly. Really looked at her. As if noticing her for the first time. You know Alejandro Vega? Danielle's face remained neutral. No. Dominic watched her carefully. He seemed very interested in you. Danielle's voice stayed quiet. That's strange. Since you've never been interested in me. Dominic didn't react to the remark. Instead, he asked one simple question. What is he talking about? Danielle met his eyes. For 4 years, she had hidden the truth. 4 years of silence. For years of watching the man she married treat her like furniture. But tonight something had changed. And she could feel it. Danger was coming. Danielle gave the same answer she had always given. Nothing. Dominic studied her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. But as Danielle closed her bedroom door behind her, one thought echoed in her mind. Alejandro Vega had just done something incredibly reckless. He had warned Dominic Russo. Because if Dominic ever discovered the truth about Danielle Carter, the entire American underworld would change. And the man who ignored her for 4 years would finally understand the mistake he made. Danielle Carter did not sleep that night. She lay awake in the enormous bedroom that had never truly felt like hers, staring at the ceiling while the distant sounds of Dominic Russo's gala slowly faded. The party downstairs ended long after midnight. Guests left. Cars drove away. Security guards resumed their silent patrol around the mansion. But Danielle remained awake, her mind racing. Alejandro Vega had made a mistake tonight. A dangerous one. He had forced Dominic to start asking questions. And questions were the one thing Danielle had spent 4 years avoiding. The truth was simple. Dominic Russo had married a woman he knew absolutely nothing about. And for 4 years, Danielle had made sure it stayed that way. She finally sat up in bed and walked toward the large glass window overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly into the darkness. New York never slept. Neither did its criminals. Neither did its secrets. Danielle crossed her arms slowly. Alejandro had been patient for years. Too patient. Which meant something had changed. Something big. Downstairs, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the mansion. Danielle recognized them immediately. Dominic. His steps were slow but purposeful. Moments later, a door slammed somewhere on the first floor. Dominic was angry. That alone was unusual. Dominic Russo was known for his control. He rarely showed emotion, and when he did, it was calculated. But tonight Alejandro had struck a nerve. Danielle stepped away from the window. She knew what would happen next. Dominic would start digging. He would ask questions. And when Dominic Russo searched for answers, he rarely stopped until he found them. That was why Danielle had built layers of protection around her past. Layers Dominic had never bothered to investigate. Because to Dominic, Danielle Carter was insignificant. Just a quiet woman who happened to be his wife. Downstairs, Dominic walked into his private office. 2 of his most trusted men were already waiting. Victor and Marco. Victor spoke first. You want us to deal with Alejandro Vega? Dominic removed his jacket slowly and tossed it across the chair. No. Marco frowned slightly. That's unusual. Dominic poured himself a drink before answering. Alejandro didn't come here to start a war. Victor leaned forward. Then why did he come? Dominic stared into the glass. To deliver a message. Marco crossed his arms. What message? Dominic repeated the exact words Alejandro had whispered. She's far more dangerous than you think. Victor scoffed. He's talking about your wife. Dominic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a different question. What do we actually know about Danielle Carter? The room grew quiet. Victor shrugged. She grew up somewhere in Chicago. Marco added, no family connections. No criminal background. Clean records. Dominic looked at them. That's it. Victor nodded. You married her 4 years ago. Private ceremony. No press. Marco chuckled slightly. To be honest, boss, most of us assumed the marriage was temporary. Dominic didn't react. But his silence meant something. Because for the first time since the marriage began, Dominic Russo was thinking about Danielle Carter. Really thinking about her. Upstairs, Danielle finally changed into comfortable clothes and sat on the edge of her bed. Her phone vibrated softly on the nightstand. She picked it up immediately. Unknown number. Danielle already knew who it was. She answered calmly. "You shouldn't have come tonight." Alejandro Vega's voice sounded amused on the other end. "You're welcome." Danielle's eyes hardened slightly. "You're playing a dangerous game." Alejandro laughed quietly. "Danielle, you've been hiding in that mansion for 4 years. Someone needed to wake your husband up." Danielle's voice dropped. "I didn't ask you to." "No," Alejandro said. "But the situation has changed." Danielle stood up slowly. "What happened?" There was a pause. Then Alejandro said something that made Danielle's stomach tighten. "Someone else is looking for you." Danielle's heart skipped once. "Who?" Alejandro's voice became serious. "People you don't want to meet." Danielle walked toward the window again. "I handled them before." Alejandro replied calmly. "That was before they knew where you were." Silence filled the call. Then Danielle spoke quietly. "How long do we have?" Alejandro answered with one word. "Not long." Danielle closed her eyes briefly. 4 years. She had managed to stay hidden for 4 years. But secrets never stayed buried forever. Especially in the criminal world. Downstairs, Dominic finished his drink. Victor leaned forward. "So what do you want us to do?" Dominic's voice was calm again. "Look into Danielle." Marco blinked. "You're serious?" Dominic met his gaze. "Everything." Victor nodded. "We'll start in the morning." Dominic shook his head. "Start now." Marco pulled out his phone immediately. "You think Alejandro was telling the truth?" Dominic stared toward the ceiling. Toward the second floor of the mansion. Toward the room where Danielle Carter lived. "I think Alejandro believes what he said." Victor frowned. "That doesn't mean it's real." Dominic's voice was quiet. "No. But it means he knows something." Upstairs, Danielle placed her phone down slowly. Alejandro had confirmed her worst fear. The past was coming. And if the wrong people reached New York, Dominic Russo's mansion would become the center of a very dangerous storm. Danielle walked toward the closet and opened a hidden drawer beneath the shelves. Inside was something Dominic Russo had never seen. A small black case. Danielle opened it carefully. Inside rested a sleek pistol. And beneath it, a gold ring engraved with a symbol very few people in the world recognized. Danielle stared at the ring for a long moment. Then she closed the case again. 4 years ago, Danielle Carter had made a decision. She chose peace. She chose anonymity. She chose to disappear inside Dominic Russo's world. But if her enemies had found her again, that peaceful life was about to end. Downstairs, Dominic stepped outside onto the balcony of his office. The cold night air hit his face. For years, he had believed he controlled every detail of his empire. Every shipment. Every alliance. Every enemy. But tonight, Alejandro Vega had planted a single, dangerous idea in Dominic's mind. The possibility that the quiet woman living in his house was someone he had completely misunderstood. Dominic looked up toward the second-floor balcony. Toward Danielle's room. He narrowed his eyes slightly. For 4 years, Dominic Russo had ignored his wife. But tomorrow, that was going to change. Because Dominic Russo never tolerated mysteries inside his own home. And Danielle Carter was starting to look like the biggest mystery of all. Dominic Russo did not sleep either. The mansion was quiet by 3 in the morning, but the lights in his private office were still on. Stacks of files covered the large mahogany desk. His men had already begun digging into Danielle Carter's past, pulling records from every system they could access. Birth records. School records. Employment history. Everything. And yet the more Dominic looked at the documents in front of him, the more irritated he became. Because the files told him absolutely nothing. Victor stood beside the desk flipping through a folder. "It's clean," he said. Marco nodded from the other side of the room. "Too clean." Dominic leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning another page. Danielle Carter. Born in Chicago. Raised in a small neighborhood on the South Side. Attended a local college. No criminal record. No known family connections. No suspicious financial activity. Just a quiet, ordinary life. Dominic tossed the file onto the desk. I don't believe it. Victor crossed his arms. You think the records are fake? Dominic's voice was calm but firm. Yes. Marco looked confused. But why would someone create an entire fake life just to marry you? Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. That's exactly the question. The room went quiet again. Victor flipped through another document. There's something strange though. Dominic looked up. What? Victor tapped the page. Her life only becomes traceable about 8 years ago. Marco frowned. What do you mean? Victor pointed again. There's almost nothing before that. Dominic leaned forward slowly. No childhood medical records. Victor shook his head. No. No school documents before high school. None. Marco's voice grew thoughtful. That's not normal. Dominic stood up. No. It's not. He walked toward the large window behind his desk, staring out at the dark skyline of Manhattan. 8 years. Someone had erased everything about Danielle Carter before that time. Which meant one thing. Danielle Carter was not her real name. Upstairs, Danielle sat quietly in the small private lounge attached to her bedroom. A single lamp illuminated the room softly. She held a cup of tea in her hands, though it had long since gone cold. Danielle had been expecting this moment for years. The moment Dominic Russo finally became curious. The moment he started searching. Her phone vibrated again. Alejandro Vega. She answered immediately. Tell me you didn't start digging already, Alejandro said. Danielle gave a quiet sigh. He did. Alejandro chuckled. I told you he would. Danielle walked toward the window again. How long until he finds something? Alejandro's voice turned serious. That depends. On what? On how good your fake identity really is. Danielle was silent. Because the identity she used now wasn't something she had created. It had been given to her. By people far more powerful than Dominic Russo. Downstairs, Dominic walked back toward his desk. Marco had opened another file. Boss, we found something. Dominic looked at him. What is it? Marco turned the laptop toward him. A news article from Chicago. Dominic read the headline slowly. Mysterious warehouse fire kills 3 organized crime leaders. Victor frowned. That was 8 years ago. Marco nodded. Yes. Dominic scanned the article carefully. The report described a violent fire that had destroyed a major warehouse used by a powerful crime syndicate. 3 high-ranking leaders had died in the explosion. But one detail caught Dominic's attention. A witness statement. Victor leaned closer. What is it? Dominic read the line out loud. A woman was seen leaving the warehouse minutes before the explosion. Marco frowned. That could be anyone. Dominic pointed to the next sentence. The witness described the woman as young, black, and covered in blood. The room went quiet. Victor leaned back slowly. That doesn't prove anything. Dominic nodded. No. But something about the story bothered him. Marco looked closer at the screen. Wait. Dominic looked up. What? Marco zoomed in on the article photo. A blurry security camera image. Smoke filled the background. Emergency lights flashed everywhere. And in the corner of the frame, a woman running into the darkness. The picture was unclear. But one thing was visible. Her hair. Long curls. Victor leaned closer. That could be Danielle. Dominic didn't answer. He was staring at the screen. Something about the woman's posture felt familiar. Too familiar. Upstairs, Danielle suddenly sensed movement in the hallway. Heavy footsteps approached. Slow. Confident. Danielle stood immediately. Dominic. A firm knock sounded on the door. Danielle opened it calmly. Dominic stood there, dressed in a dark shirt and trousers, his expression unreadable. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Dominic said quietly, "We need to talk." Danielle stepped aside. Dominic walked into the room, his eyes scanning the space briefly. It was simple. Minimal furniture. No decorations. Almost like a hotel room. "You've lived here 4 years," Dominic said. "And it still looks temporary." Danielle folded her arms slightly. I never planned on staying forever. Dominic turned toward her. That might happen sooner than you think. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Why? Dominic stepped closer. I looked into your past. Danielle's face remained calm. And? Dominic studied her carefully. Your life only exists for the last 8 years. Danielle said nothing. Dominic continued. No childhood records. No family history. No real identity. Silence filled the room. Dominic's voice lowered. So I'll ask you directly. He stepped closer. Who are you really? Danielle met his eyes without fear. That depends. Dominic frowned slightly. On what? Danielle answered quietly. On whether you're ready to know. Dominic's patience was fading. Stop playing games. Danielle's voice remained calm. I'm not. Dominic leaned closer. I saw the Chicago warehouse report. For the first time, Danielle's expression changed slightly. Dominic noticed. His voice hardened. You were there. Danielle took a slow breath. Yes. Dominic's eyes darkened. Why? Danielle looked directly at him. Because I burned it down. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Dominic stared at her. You're serious? Danielle nodded. Yes. Dominic took a step back. You killed 3 crime leaders. Danielle shook her head slightly. No. Dominic frowned. What do you mean? Danielle's voice turned colder than he had ever heard it before. I killed 6. Dominic's eyes narrowed. But only 3 bodies were found. Danielle walked toward the window. That's because the others never made it inside. Dominic stared at her. For the first time since their marriage began, he was seeing Danielle Carter differently. Not as the quiet woman who lived in his house, but as someone far more dangerous. Dominic spoke slowly. Why hide here? Danielle answered without turning around. Because I was tired of running. Dominic crossed his arms. And you thought marrying me would help? Danielle finally looked back at him. Yes. Dominic frowned. Why? Danielle's answer was simple. Because no one is stupid enough to attack Dominic Russo. At that exact moment, a loud explosion shook the entire mansion. The windows rattled violently. Alarms began blaring throughout the house. Dominic immediately turned toward the door. Marco's voice echoed through the hallway. Boss! Someone just breached the front gate. Dominic's eyes snapped back toward Danielle. But she was already moving. Opening the black case hidden in her closet. Dominic saw the pistol in her hand. Danielle checked the weapon calmly. Then she looked at him. Her voice was steady. They found me. Outside, gunfire suddenly erupted across the mansion grounds. And Dominic Russo realized one terrifying truth. The quiet woman he ignored for 4 years had just become the most important person in his entire empire. The first gunshots shattered the silence of the night. Automatic weapons roared across the front of the Russo mansion, echoing through the cold Manhattan air. Security alarms screamed while Dominic's guards rushed into position outside. Dominic stepped into the hallway instantly. Marco! Marco appeared from the staircase, already holding a rifle. 4 SUVs crashed the gate, he reported quickly. At least 15 men. Victor ran past them toward the security monitors. They're heavily armed. Dominic's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Who sent them? Victor checked the screens again. They're not local. Dominic frowned. What do you mean? Victor zoomed the camera feed. Black tactical uniforms. Military precision. And a symbol painted on one of the vehicles. Victor's expression tightened. I've never seen that before. Behind them, Danielle stepped out of the bedroom holding the pistol she had taken from the hidden case. Dominic turned toward her. You're staying here. Danielle didn't even slow down. No. Dominic's tone hardened. This is my house. My fight. Danielle stopped in front of him. No, she said calmly. This is my past catching up. Another explosion shook the mansion. Glass shattered somewhere downstairs. Marco cursed under his breath. They're blowing the side entrance. Dominic turned back toward Danielle. Start explaining. Danielle looked toward the security screens. They're not here for you. Victor glanced back at her. Then who? Danielle's voice was steady. Me. Dominic studied her face. You knew this would happen. Danielle didn't deny it. I knew it was possible. Dominic's eyes darkened. You brought this war into my house. Danielle shook her head slowly. No. They were already coming. Before Dominic could respond, another burst of gunfire echoed through the mansion. Marco spoke quickly into his radio. Hold the line at the courtyard. One of the guards shouted through the speaker. They're pushing through. Dominic grabbed a rifle from the wall cabinet. Victor, secure the upper floor. Victor nodded immediately. Marco turned toward Danielle. You should stay in the safe room. Danielle checked the pistol calmly. They'll reach it in 10 minutes. Marco blinked. You sound very sure. Danielle glanced at the security screen again. I trained them. The room went quiet. Dominic slowly turned his head toward her. You what? Danielle holstered the pistol and grabbed another magazine from the case. 8 years ago, she said quietly, I worked for an organization that trains private military groups. Victor frowned. Mercenaries. Danielle nodded. Yes. Dominic's voice was low. And you just walked away. Danielle's eyes hardened slightly. I didn't walk away. I burned it down. Dominic remembered what she had said earlier. The Chicago warehouse fire. The 6 men she killed. Suddenly the story made sense. Dominic spoke slowly. They want revenge. Danielle nodded. Yes. Marco shook his head. That explains why they're hitting this hard. Victor checked the screen again. They're inside the courtyard. Dominic raised the rifle. Then we stop them here. But Danielle stepped forward. No. Dominic looked at her sharply. What? Danielle pointed to the screen. They're not attacking randomly. Dominic looked again. The intruders were moving in tight formations. Methodical. Efficient. Danielle continued calmly. They're heading toward the upper floor. Victor's eyes widened. They know the layout. Danielle nodded once. Yes. Dominic's jaw tightened. Then someone told them. Danielle met his gaze. Or they learned it years ago. Dominic frowned. What does that mean? Danielle spoke quietly. I helped design the security system in this house. The 3 men stared at her. Marco blinked. You what? Danielle crossed her arms. 4 years ago, when we got married. Dominic suddenly remembered something. One evening shortly after their wedding, Danielle had walked through the mansion with an architect and several contractors. Dominic hadn't cared enough to ask why. Danielle continued. You assumed I was redecorating. Victor muttered. You were redesigning the defenses. Danielle nodded. Yes. Dominic exhaled slowly. So the attackers know the same weaknesses. Danielle's voice remained calm. Yes. Marco shook his head. That's a problem. Another gunfight erupted downstairs. A guard screamed through the radio. They're inside. Dominic turned toward the staircase. We hold them here. But Danielle grabbed his arm. Dominic looked down at her hand. Then back at her face. What? Danielle spoke quickly. If we stay here, they win. Victor frowned. What do you mean? Danielle pointed to the monitor again. The team entering from the east wing. They're not soldiers. Marco leaned closer. Then what are they? Danielle answered quietly. Assassins. Dominic narrowed his eyes. For who? Danielle didn't hesitate. For me. The truth hit the room like a hammer. Dominic finally understood. This attack wasn't about territory or power. It was about one woman. The woman he had ignored for 4 years. Danielle Carter. Another explosion rocked the mansion. Victor shouted. They're breaking through the lobby. Dominic lifted the rifle again. We move. Danielle stepped in front of him. No. Dominic glared at her. Move. Danielle didn't budge. You don't understand. Dominic's voice dropped dangerously. Then explain it fast. Danielle met his eyes. They're not afraid of you. Marco scoffed. Everyone's afraid of Dominic Russo. Danielle shook her head. Not these men. Victor frowned. Why? Danielle answered simply. Because they were trained to kill people like him. Dominic stared at her. And you? Danielle's voice was calm. I trained them. The room fell silent again. Dominic slowly lowered the rifle. For 4 years he had believed Danielle Carter was just a quiet woman hiding inside his mansion. But the truth was far more complicated. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Dominic spoke carefully. How many are outside? Danielle glanced at the monitor. 17. Marco cursed. That's a lot. Danielle corrected him. No. She loaded another magazine into the pistol. That's not a lot. Dominic raised an eyebrow. You're confident. Danielle looked at him. Because I know how they think. Victor asked the question everyone was wondering. So what's the plan? Danielle turned toward the hallway. We don't defend the house. Dominic frowned. What? Danielle's eyes were sharp now. We hunt them. Marco chuckled nervously. You sound like you've done this before. Danielle didn't smile. I have. Another burst of gunfire echoed from downstairs. Dominic studied her carefully. For the first time since their marriage began, he was seeing the real Danielle Carter. Not the quiet woman who lived in his mansion, but the fighter she had always been. Dominic finally nodded once. Fine. He lifted the rifle again. You lead. Danielle opened the hallway door slowly. Gunfire flashed from the staircase below. Shadows moved across the walls. Danielle stepped forward without hesitation. Dominic followed behind her. Marco and Victor right behind him. As they moved toward the stairs, Dominic spoke quietly. One question. Danielle glanced back. What? Dominic's voice was calm. How many men did you say you killed in Chicago? Danielle answered without slowing down. 6. Dominic nodded. Good. He chambered around in the rifle. Because tonight. His eyes hardened. You might need to kill a few more. Downstairs, the assassins spread through the mansion. Searching. Hunting. But they didn't know something yet. The woman they came to kill was no longer hiding. And Dominic Russo had finally realized the truth. The quiet wife he ignored for 4 years was the most dangerous ally he could ever have.